Hi everyone, it's another episode of Ukraine Battlefield Breakdown. My name is Mykola Bielieskov. I'm research fellow at Ukrainian National Institute for Strategic Studies and also senior analyst at the Comeback Alive charity, biggest non-governmental charity that is aiding armed forces of Ukraine. And today I'd like to talk less about some conceptual things, as we talked previously, and some practical things about specifically one Russian capability that become prominent this year, and this so-called glide bombs. And in this episode, I'd like to cover a couple of things. So how Russians come to the conclusion that glide bombs are important, role of glide bombs in Russian tactics, and how the problem of Russian glide bombs should be addressed. The first part is how Russia come to employ glide bombs en masse. And to answer this question, we need to make a step back and return to the first months of all-out Russian aggression against Ukraine. When big war started on 24th of February 2022, Russian piloted aviation was unable to gain air supremacy through the suppression of land-based air defenses. And it didn't prevent them from using piloted aviation, but there was a problem. Back at that time, though Russia nominally has better combat planes than 10-15 years ago, they have very outdated munitions. And this was so-called free-fall dump bombs. And they placed limitations on how Russian piloted aviation is employed. Because given the unguided character of these bombs, the pilot need to come as close as possible to the target. And this made the combat planes and the pilots very vulnerable. And we've seen a lot of instances in the first months of all-out big war when Russian combat planes like Su-34, Su-30, even Su-35, they were targeted and shot down by Ukrainian Soviet origin land-based air defense, or even manpads. So Russians made the conclusion that it's too risky to direct piloted aviation which employed free-fall dump bombs in the depths of Ukrainian airspace. And since April 2022, Russians didn't dare to direct their piloted aviation in depths of Ukrainian airspace. So basically, in the first 40-45 days, relying primarily on land-based air defense of the Soviet origin, 1970s, 1980s capabilities, we managed to implement so-called air denial strategy against piloted aviation and basically neutralize Russian piloted aviation when we are talking about strikes which affect in-depth targets in the rear of Ukraine. That's why Russians switched to strikes which involved cruise and ballistic missiles and one-way Shahed UAVs. The fact that we managed to achieve this feat, quite an achievement by Ukrainian standards, it doesn't mean that Russians were satisfied by this. And since the start of 2023, they become to do a number of experiments when they use these dump free-fall bombs and combine them with so-called mechanism for the correction of the flight. It's basically wings that are attached to this dump Soviet bomb that allows them to do a number of things. So first, it increases range, because free-fall bombs, they have the range of maybe 10 kilometers at best. If combined with this mechanism for better flight, this basically wings, it increases the range of the munition. And if, for instance, the pilot discharges the munition at the heights of 10 kilometers, then the range of this munition is 40 kilometers. And also this mechanism, it not only increases the range, but it also increases the precision. Because basically Russians attach a module which turn unguided munition into guided munition. It's basically a receiver of GPS signal that allows this bomb to be directed at specific target. So basically, during 2023, Russians again did a progress and they polished this technology. Basically, with these modules for the correction of the flight, they get a cheap, rough equivalent of American joint direct attack munition or French Hammer so-called munition that is also supplied to Ukraine. And the next stage started roughly since the beginning of this year when Russians start to employ these munitions en masse. Basically, now, according to some official estimates, Russian employ 130, 140 munitions of this kind along the whole front line. So the intensity vary. So it doesn't mean that it's evenly divided. Majority of the strikes, they are concentrated against priority targets. And now we're talking about 6 or even 7,000 of this kind of munitions employed against Ukrainian position during this year, according again to Ukrainian figures. We can say that glide bombs is the sole source of all the Russian progress we've seen since the beginning of 2024. But what we can say is that these bombs, they contributed to the Russian successes. Yes, limited one, but still successes. So the fact that they were able to push us out of Avdiivka is explained by the intensity of glide bombs employment increase during 2024 compared with 2023 or non-existence in 2022. And on its own, glide bombs at the intensity of 130, 140 pieces a day, it's not about meeting all the requirements of Russian forces in terms of fire support. But it's valuable addition, and it has two kinds of impact. One is physical, so that's powerful bombs of usually 500 kilograms, less 1,500 kilograms. I'm pretty sure that 3,100 kilograms won't be a usual scene. So there are limits in terms of range and all other things. So it's usually either 500 or 1,000 or 1,500 kilos. And it's quite a problem when it's targeting positions. So Russians even dare to use this kind of things against operators of UAVs. It means that they are pretty confident in this capability and have this kind of luxury. So it's a complement to Russian system of fire, which has both physical and psychological impact, because imagine being on the front line, being targeted with this potent capability. So it has also psychological impact, very negative one. It's not a sophisticated capability. It's basically just some primary casting of metal into the specific forms. So it doesn't require kind of capability even to produce like a barrel for artillery, which is more demanding scene. So unfortunately, in this case, we can't count on the scenario that Russia would feel a deficit. So Russia has tens of thousands of this bomb from the USSR that were produced for the Soviet army. And they also have this basic production capability. So it's not so demanding. And that's why they can retain this rate of 130, 140, 150 glide bombs released a day for some time. So that's why just waiting when this munition is depleted is not an option for Ukraine if we want to stop Russian advances, which is number one priority for Ukraine right now. This level of damage depends on how successful Russians at guiding this munition at the target, because there are some instances when they are missing their targets. For sure, it's compensated with the power of the warhead. So when you are targeted by the 500 kilos, 1 ton, 1.5 ton kilos of TNT, if it misses tens of meters, it doesn't matter still. But in terms of destroying buildings, it's the same comparable capability, or even bigger one, compared with standard Russian ballistic and cruise missiles. So cruise missile of X-101 warhead power is approximately 480 kilograms. So it's a comparable power when we are comparing with this 500 kilo variant. So it's a very potent scene. And if it's targeting buildings, it can demolish them. Or if it's targeting specific Ukrainian position, so if Russians for sure know that there is a kind of stronghold, a strong position, very important point of Ukrainian defense, or as a command and control node. Unfortunately, if it's successful in striking the target at proper coordinates, it can demolish or critically damage. So it's very potent. Seeing it's in terms of the weight of a warhead, it's one of the most potent things in a Russian arsenal. For sure, it has its own limits. So the limits is maybe 60, 70 kilometers at best, because you can't beyond some constraints of physics. So you can see something comparable in US arsenal, and usually JDAM extended range it has a range of 60, 70 kilometers. So it's not a kind of capabilities that affect the whole Ukraine, but it still affect the front line. And unfortunately, along the front line, we have not only system of Ukrainian defense that should be protected, but also a number of urban areas. First, Kharkiv, but not only Kharkiv, but also a number of settlements in Donetsk region, and also theoretically it might be Zaporizhia. We also seen instances of employing this kind of weaponry against Sumy. So that's why it's about the security and people's life along the front line. And that's a problem because it's also affect not only immediate Ukrainian position, but immediate rear behind the Ukrainian position. So that's also the problem because it destroys not only infrastructure on which our people and troops depend, but it also affects logistics. And there are cases when Russians try to affect logistics employing these glide bombs. They actually a challenge for Ukraine because the system we operate, they don't have a proper range to target the platform because we can't address these glide bombs themselves. That's too difficult. So it's about targeting the platform. So it's either targeting the platform in flight or on the airfield. In flight, it's only Patriot surface-to-air missiles. But this method is very risky and very costly. Why it's very risky? Basically, you need to place a battery of Patriot along the front line. And unfortunately, we've seen a number of incidents this year when Russians, since they saturate the immediate rear of Ukrainian position with reconnaissance and manned aerial vehicles, they basically monitor the situation, and that's why if we place surface-to-air missile close to the front line, it became vulnerable. And now we know at least one incident when Russians, unfortunately, were able to damage at least some of the launchers of this surface-to-air missile complex. And it's also pricey because the price of one interceptor is from $2 to $4 million. That's way too far. And we also have a dilemma. We have a deficit of these surface-to-air missiles. It creates for us a choice, very unpleasant choice, because we need to defend either frontline and frontline formations, land formations, or we need to defend the rear. That's a big problem for Ukrainian political and military leadership, and we're only approaching, hopefully, when all the promises of Washington NATO summit are implemented, of having at least 7 batteries of either Patriot surface-to-air missiles or SAMP-T, also surface-to-air missiles. Another possibility that was discussed, it's actually in the context of F-16s that were recently received. But there is a problem, because Russia employed these glide bombs along the front line. And along the front line, Russia has so-called integrated air and missile defense system. So yes, it's either Soviet S-300 of different modifications or more modern, improved S-400 modifications. And before we suppress this air defense system, it requires a lot of effort and too risky to employ F-16s, even with most modern AIM-120 missile. And again, it requires the kind of conditions that cannot be created instantly. So you need to have at least a pair of F-16s in air. Then they need to be directed to this segment on the front line. And usually they can target Su-34s that are usually employed to release glide bombs when they return, basically. Because I'm pretty sure that they can release this bomb before they are targeted by F-16s. So F-16s is also quite a risky and costly option. And that's why we come to the final point, how we can address it cheaply and without risk. And the solution is simple one. It's already been raised by Ukrainian leadership. It's a simple Ukrainian plea that all the restrictions to employ short-range ballistic missiles of ATACMS type to be lifted. Let's imagine the situation that these restrictions are lifted. And I'm pretty sure that the time would come, even maybe this year, when these restrictions are lifted, because that's what is sound military strategy is about. So let's imagine Ukraine has this freedom of employment of this short-range ballistic missile. It allowed to target airfields at the range of 250 to 180 kilometers from the front line. For sure, we can't destroy every single launching platform, but we can create a proper level of risk for Russians to bring these combat planes which release glide bombs back to the rear of the Russia. And it first decreases the intensity of the strikes, and it also increases wear and tear on the planes. So basically, it's the most cheap, cost-effective, and risk-free solution. And that's the reason why Ukraine is appealing to our partners. That's the problems that definitely need to be addressed. It's a good example how Russians managed to bring back piloted aviation. It's not a Wunderwaffe. It's not the capability that on its own would bring and ensure Russian ultimate success. But it's something that can be addressed quite shortly. The only issue is, again, do a right step at the right time to save as much lives as possible and do it cost-free and risk-free compared with other options I've described before.